Looking Forth, episode 79B. The purpose of this podcast is to help us know how we can prepare for the second coming with hope, to better know what specific events are prophesied prior to the second coming, and to understand how these Old Testament stories we're reading in Come Follow Me have parallels with second coming events that can help us better understand and prepare for those. In this episode, we're reading in the book of Zephaniah in chapter 1. And we're going to look at what end times events did Zephaniah predict. Everything in here is color-coded. If it's in yellow or gold, it's official church doctrine. Green are teachings from church sources, and purple are my own personal interpretations and ideas. Let's start with a framework. I believe that there's going to be a time of tribulation. It's called often the time of Jacob's troubles, or great tribulations are the actual phrases you can search in the scriptures. They're also called harvests in the book of Revelations. You can see it describes a wheat harvest and a grape harvest in the book of Revelation. One way of looking at these harvests is that God is going to have a transition period to prepare his people and prepare the world for the millennium. And the tribulation years are that period of time. Now, I believe there's two overlapping tribulation periods. One is for the house of Judah, the Jews, and one is a 7-year period for the house of Joseph or Ephraim. Here you have the main wives of Jacob or Israel, Leah and Rachel. Their children are represented through this. These 7-year periods are overlapping, so the middle 3.5 years overlap each other. Looking at this in breakouts, you have the barley harvest, which is the first 3.5 years of the 7-year tribulation for the house of Joseph or Ephraim. And then you have the wheat harvest, which is the last 3.5 year period for the house of Joseph. And the Jewish tribulations follow a similar idea. You have a first 3.5 years, which is during the same 3.5 year period that the wheat harvest is going on. And then you have the final 3.5 years, which are the grape harvest. The idea behind this is each of these harvests actually correspond to what the Israelites had in their appointed times, their feasts or holy days. They had a barley harvest in the spring that is called first fruits. Then you had a wheat harvest that came in the summertime, and that was celebrated by the Feast of Pentecost. And then you had this grape harvest, which was celebrated by the Feast of Tabernacles. So you had these harvests that happened in the spring, the summer, and the fall. So they came one after the other. This is where you get the idea of these 3 harvests and why you have 2 overlapping 7-year periods of time. The barley is something that's very easy to harvest. With barley, all you have to do is basically shake it, and the barley comes free, and then you just gather it up. With wheat, it's a little more work to do that harvest. With the wheat, you actually have to break it up by beating it. Then you have to throw up the wheat berries into the air, and the chaff goes away in the wind. So it's a fair amount of work to do wheat. Now, grapes and olives and things like that would be harvested in the fall take the most amount of work. You literally have to press those. So grapes or olives would have to be pressed by stones, maybe crushed under the feet, gathered. So the grape or olive harvest is something that requires the most work. Barley requires the least. And this goes in order. It's showing that those that are harvested by the Lord, in other words, brought to sanctification, woken up, prepared for Zion, the easiest ones are going to be harvested first during the barley harvest. And I believe we're in that right now. I think the symbols of that are all these people who are waking up to the fact that Jesus Christ is real, that the end times are here, that now is a time to prepare for the second coming. Well, I believe that's the barley harvest. That's what we're in. And I think President Nelson told us that. And once again, I believe the timeline was given by Elder Gary Stevenson in his talk, Days Never to Be Forgotten, in which he lays out an odd decade, which is 2024 to 2034. Usually you do it from the zeros, the 2020 to 2030, but he started at 2024 and went to 2034. He said that that decade was going to be just as powerful as the very first decade of the church, from the first vision in 1820 to the founding of the church in 1830. For us, whether it actually happens to be that these tribulation years happen from 2024 to 2034, or if they happen in some other time, the idea of these tribulation years and the different harvests still holds true. So don't get fixated on the dates as much. Instead, understand that God does things line upon line. The barley harvest is the first line. And then after those people are harvested, they can then do what? Prepare the rest of the world. They go help prepare the wheat by building up and gathering Zion. Then the 144,000 are prepared, and they go help gather the remainder of the people throughout the grape harvest and to help the Jews with the 2 witnesses. So you can see there's this building that happens during the tribulation years. That's clearly shown in the scriptures. So whether you believe in the actual 7-year timelines, the 3.5-year divisions of that, if the ideas here are in the scriptures, this follows the Lord's pattern of doing things. And I hope this helps you understand when I talk about in the scriptures, I believe this relates to the barley harvest, or the wheat harvest, or the grape harvest. That's what I'm talking about, is this idea of a progression in the tribulation years just prior to the second coming, where the trials and difficulties get greater and greater, and it's necessarily so that the people will wake up. Then those people who are woken up earlier help with the gathering and the building of Zion. So the book of Zephaniah, like the book of Joel, which we went over previously, is an apocalyptic book. It's a book that talks about the end times primarily. And it starts off in Zephaniah chapter 1 talking about the destruction of Judah, which is symbolic of the second coming. So this is a prophecy. These are things that are primarily about things to come. We're going to start off in Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 2. Quote, "I will utterly consume all things from off the land, saith the Lord." End quote. Now you'll see there's 3 columns like I used in Joel. The first column in this table shows the verses, and they're linked. So in the show description, the bottom of this video, you can go to the word more, click on it. It'll show you the text about this video. And at the bottom, there'll be a link to a Google document. And you can actually go to that and see all of the things that are right here. The first column is the verses that are linked. The second column, this is the description of that verse. And then I give my own possible interpretations in the third column. So I want you, as you read through these chapters yourself, listen to the Spirit and see what ideas you come up with, because you might come up with different ones. The Lord usually has multiple interpretations, multiple ways we can understand each and every verse. And the reason for that is God has multiple lessons to teach us from the scriptures. And each of us has different experiences and knowledge. But the Spirit's going to teach you, if you look through here diligently, the things that you need to do to prepare. It's going to give you ideas about things that may affect you or you may see in your lifetime. I give these interpretations, these ideas, as a way to get you started on that. You can look at how I looked at it, and then you can go from there. So the possible interpretation of Zephaniah 1, verse 2, is the destruction of the great and abominable church during the wheat harvest. Now, the reason I come up with that is because there's a footnote in here in verse 2 that goes to 1 Nephi 22:23. And this is what it says about this destruction, this consuming. Quote, "For the time speedily shall come that all churches which are built up to get gain, and all those who are built up to get power over the flesh, and all those who are built up to become popular in the eyes of the world, and those who seek the lusts of the flesh and the things of the world, and to do all manner of iniquity, yea, in fine, all those who belong to the kingdom of the devil, are they who need fear and tremble and quake. They are those who must be brought low in the dust. They are those who must be consumed as stubble. And this according to the words of the prophet." End quote. So here, modern-day apostles have linked Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 2 with 1 Nephi 22, talking about these great and abominable churches, which is really the kingdom of the devil. And this links to Revelation 17, 16 through 17, where you hear about what's going to happen eventually during the tribulation years to the great and abominable church. Quote, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest upon the beast, these shall hate the whore, and shall make her desolate and naked, and shall eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God hath put into their hearts to fulfill his will, and to agree and give their kingdom unto the beast, until the words of God shall be fulfilled." End quote. So here we have these 10 horns. In Joel chapter 1, we talked about them being sent forth to destroy the great and abominable church, which is a synonym for the whore of all the earth, or Mystery Babylon. All different names for the same group. And that group are those who build up churches, but not unto God, for popularity or for money. They are those who build up ideologies, which are meant to lead the saints away from Christ. They are all the worldly organizations, including the secret combinations, which gather together for these same purposes, for fulfilling their lusts, evading the consequences of their crimes, enriching themselves or giving themselves more power. The Lord groups all of these different types of organizations together under the name, the whore of all the earth, and the great and abominable church. It's important to know that the Lord is going to put into the hearts of these 10 horns, who are end times leaders, to destroy the great and abominable church. Now you may ask why? Likely because the wicked never really trust other wicked groups. They lust for soul power. So they are paranoid and they don't trust each other, and with good reason. Every leader of secret combinations down through all the centuries has always been deposed by another leader of secret combinations. So they unite together against the saints, and they unite together to protect one another from the laws, but they also end up being the destruction of one another. This destruction of the great and abominable church comes well before the destruction of all the telestial by fire when Jesus Christ appears in the clouds to the entire world. So this is something that happens, I believe, within the wheat harvest, near the end of the wheat harvest. Now let's go to verse 3. Quote, I will consume man and beast. I will consume the fowls of the heaven and the fishes of the sea, and the stumbling blocks with the wicked. And I will cut off man from the land, saith the Lord. End quote. So we get this idea that during these times, during the wheat harvest, the times before the destruction of the great and abominable church, the Lord is going to be causing destructions among men, among beasts, fowls, even fishes. We hear about this destruction, for instance, in Joel chapter 1. If you read verses 19 and 20 of Joel chapter 1, they talk about the same thing. Quote, O Lord, to thee will I cry, for the fire hath devoured the pastures of the wilderness, and the flame hath burned all the trees of the field. So these things that the Lord is talking about have an effect on all the animals. This destruction of the pastures is really synonymous with the very first trumpet at the beginning of the seventh seal that brings down hail and fire that destroys a third of the green things, trees and grasses upon the earth. And of course, that's the food for the beasts and the fowls. And the fishes are also later affected by the second trumpet, which is this mountain that comes into the sea, and that poisons the waters and kills off a third of the fishes and the sea life. So all of these tie together. These prophets are seeing similar times, and you can see these ties between them. But there's one other thing that I think is interesting that the Lord talks about being consumed. He calls it our stumbling blocks. I believe a good way of thinking of this is these are our idols. And the way I know this is because the footnote for our stumbling blocks goes to Ezekiel 7:19. Quote, And they shall cast their silver in the streets, and their gold shall be removed, and their silver and gold shall not be able to deliver them in the day of the wrath of the Lord. They shall not satisfy their souls, neither fill their bowels, because it is the stumbling block of their iniquity. End quote. So you can see why the apostles linked this verse in Ezekiel 7 with Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 3. It's the stumbling blocks. Here it's just explained more. They're the stumbling blocks of our iniquity, which include things like our silver and gold. Many people today idolize their wealth, and that becomes a stumbling block to them. Well, the Lord says those stumbling blocks are going to be consumed during this time of the wheat harvest. And you can see this pretty easily because all of these destructions and this anarchy that is being described in Zephaniah chapter 1 is going to make it so your money becomes worthless. It's not going to be able to deliver you. and all the other things that we got used to in the times of the Gentiles, perhaps our internet, perhaps our sports teams, or the other things that we used to spend a lot of time on that instead took away time from us helping one another, serving the Lord and learning of him. Those stumbling blocks are going to be removed during this time. The switch from the times of the Gentiles to these years of tribulation is going to be a huge change of life, and people are going to be reeling from this change. However, if you think about it, if our internet and our sports teams were gone, if our phones were gone, if all of these stumbling blocks that distracted us were gone, we might really have time to think about what's really important. In that way, removing the stumbling blocks becomes a blessing rather than a curse. Let's now go to Zephaniah 1, verse 4. Here, God brings his hand against the wicked in Judah. Quote, I will also stretch out mine hand upon Judah and upon all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the name of the cherethims with the priests. End quote. So there could be a number of meanings to this, but certainly the place is being given to us here, Judah and Jerusalem. And you'll find that Zephaniah primarily focuses on the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem, whereas Joel evenly divided his prophecies between the Jews and the house of Joseph in America. So what are some possible meanings for this? Well, cutting off the remnant of Baal. One of the things that stands out to me is I think of the terrible crime of abortion. And to me, that symbolizes Baal. It's the type and shadow of Baal in our modern times, because they used to sacrifice their children to these idols, to Baal and to Moloch. And that human sacrifice of their own babies, of their own children, to me mirrors abortion that continues ongoing throughout the world. And you can think about if there was a great destruction where economically everything crashed, where there were big enough disruptions to supply chains and to economies, where suddenly all the things that were our distractions or our stumbling blocks were cut off, we certainly wouldn't have the money and the means to be able to do things like abortion, or at least not at the rate that we're doing it now. One thing, too, it talks about here in 2 Nephi, and this comes from a footnote, 2 Nephi 19, verses 19 through 21, a similar time, and Isaiah describes a similar time. And remember, we know these two are connected because it's a footnote that's made by Latter-day Apostles. Quote, through the wrath of the Lord of hosts is the land darkened, and the people shall be as the fuel of the fire. No man shall spare his brother, and he shall snatch on the right hand and be hungry, and he shall eat on the left hand, and they shall not be satisfied. They shall eat every man the flesh of his own arm. Manasseh Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh, they together shall be against Judah. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still. End quote. So here Isaiah, seeing these same times as Zephaniah, describes anarchy. He describes that the people, no man shall spare his brother. That's anarchy. And many of the Latter-day Apostles have talked about a similar time in these tribulation years where there is not so much civil war where you have two groups against each other, but everyone against everyone. You can see here snatching on the right hand and being hungry, and eat on the left hand and not satisfied. People just taking and stealing and looting to feed themselves because of this famine, and yet it's not enough. This final verse in 21, Manasseh Ephraim and Ephraim Manasseh, and both shall be against Judah, it almost sounds like all peoples will be against everyone else. So here in America, during the wheat harvest, you have Manasseh, which are the children of Lehi. They are what we call the Lamanites today. You have Ephraim, which are the Latter-day Saints. And you have the Jews, who will be represented by Judah here in this verse. And it won't matter. You'll have everyone against everyone in this kind of anarchy and famine situation. During all this, notice that God says that his anger is not turned away, but, meaning despite the fact that his anger is not turned away, his hand is stretched out still. That means God is willing to take any by the hand lead them to Zion places of safety out of this famine and anarchy and fighting, and lead people to safety and protect them for all people. Now let's go to verses 5 and 6. And here God reads through a list of different types of people who are wicked, who are going to be cut off during this time. The possible interpretation for this is those who worship these Gentile idols of wealth, sports teams, the internet, of themselves and their body image. They are going to be cut off from the Spirit, cut off from God, as well as those who are raised with a knowledge of God, but who have apostatized or have been apathetic in their faith. So the Lord's actual language here in verse 6 is, and them that are turned back from the Lord, and those that have not sought the Lord, nor inquired of him. Turning back from the Lord is apostasy. Those who have not sought the Lord, nor inquired for him, are those who are apathetic. Their faith is weak. These are the people who are going to be cut off from the very arm that is stretched out to help them during these tribulation years. And they're going to be exposed to the full destructions, the violence, the famine, and the other things that are prophesied here by Zephaniah. Now in verse 7 here, the Lord is going to use some language that I think is very symbolic. Let's read it. Quote, "Hold thy peace at the presence of the Lord God, for the day of the Lord is at hand. For the Lord hath prepared a sacrifice, he hath bid his guests." End quote. First of all, if you click on this footnote here for hold thy peace, this goes to Habakkuk 2:20, which says, quote, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him." End quote. This is an allusion to the Lord returning suddenly to his temple in Jackson County. That's his second coming appearance there. Once again, this gives us the timeline of when this is to happen. This is during the wheat harvest. Also notice the day of the Lord is at hand. So this is the day of the Lord's power, a day when all these miracles and destructions happen. What about the Lord preparing a sacrifice? Well, one way to understand this is a sacrifice where he has bid his guests. This makes me think about the wedding feast, the place where Jesus Christ appears to his bride, Zion, and is sealed to them, blesses them with the blessings of exaltation. Another thing that this made me think about, this sacrifice is spoken of in verse 8 as well. And there's a talk where I think the key to understanding this comes from. Let's go ahead and read in 8 first. Quote, "And it shall come to pass in the day of the Lord's sacrifice that I will punish the princes and the king's children and all such as are clothed with strange apparel." So here, the day of the Lord's sacrifice is once again mentioned. And I actually did a search of this through our general conference talks, and I came to this powerful talk by President Ezra Taft Benson in April of 1979, while he was the head of the Quorum of the 12 before he became the prophet. It's called "This is a Day of Sacrifice." Let's read that. See if this doesn't give you a better understanding of what the day of the Lord's sacrifice could be. Quote, "The Lord said in September of 1831, now it is called today, until the coming of the Son of Man. And verily, it is a day of sacrifice of my people." The prophet Joseph Smith prepared this remarkable statement on the principle of sacrifice for the lectures on faith. Let us here observe that a religion that does not require the sacrifice of all things never has power sufficient to produce the faith necessary unto life and salvation. End quote. So here President Ezra Taft Benson is reminding us that from the restoration until the coming of the Son of Man in one of his second coming appearances is a day of sacrifice of God's people. It's a day for us to make sacrifices. And that unless we as a people, his people, make that sacrifice of all things, we won't have the faith necessary unto life and salvation. This to me links together this day of sacrifice to the sacrifice that the saints will have to make in being persecuted and going through these difficulties, all of the things that are preparatory to us building up Zion, the things that sanctify us. I think that especially we're going to see that the Lord is bidding his guests by bidding them to come through this sacrifice and then come to Zion, where they're going to have this wedding feast with the bridegroom, Jesus Christ. This time when this happens, I believe is going to be during the half hour of silence. Now, a lot of people have wondered about what the half hour of silence means. I think one way of understanding it, it is the time where the Lord is silent during these injustices happening during the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, in which his people are being afflicted and persecuted and going through all these terrible things when they are trying to be righteous. They're trying to follow him. That end of that time of silence will be when he builds Zion or saves it, and finally when he comes in glory to the saints in Jackson County, Missouri, to the temple. So you can see how sacrifice and this time of silence of the heavens and all of these troubles during the wheat harvest all tie together, and they have a purpose. Understanding that there's a purpose is helpful to us, but it'll help us get through that. Finally, at the end of verse 8, the Lord actually talks about the first of three groups of people that he says are going to be punished. And here he calls them the princes and the children of the king and those who wear strange apparel. And the footnote to strange apparel simply means costly apparel. So these are the rich and powerful of the times of the Gentiles. They are going to be punished during these times of tribulations. We're going to see two other groups that are mentioned in verses 9, 10, and 11 that will also be punished. In verse 9, the Lord talks about those who rob and commit violence. The end times parallel is those who are violent or loot, and these are likely to be the poor during the anarchy of the wheat harvest will be punished by God. The Lord is going to see all the things that have happened previously and that happened during these years of tribulation, and everyone will have justice for those unless they repent. In verses 10 through 11, the Lord mentions Jerusalem and several parts of Jerusalem in specific. So he's talking here about the Jews, and he also mentions the merchants. And so I believe the end times parallel for this is all parts of Jerusalem, and including the middle classes. So those are the merchants will mourn. It'll be a terrible time for the poor, the middle class, and the rich. No one will escape the difficulties of these years. Now let's go to verse 12, and this is where things start to turn for the better. Let's read it. Quote, "And it shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with candles, and punish the men that are settled on their lees, that say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil." End quote. So here, the Lord talks about punishing those who are complacent. And you can see that through the footnotes here. But the part that gives me hope is he says, I will search Jerusalem with candles. There's another part of the scriptures that sounds just like this. It's not in the footnotes, but this is one the Spirit reminded me of. This is in Ezekiel 9:4. And this is Ezekiel seeing the destruction of Jerusalem, so same place as Zephaniah is seeing. Here, look at what the Lord is doing in Jerusalem in this verse. Quote, "And the Lord said unto him, Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and cry for all the abominations that are done in the midst thereof." End quote. So here Ezekiel is talking about angels invisibly going through the city and setting a mark on the foreheads of everyone who was repentant, who was weighed down by the sins that was happening in their city. And this is specifically Jerusalem. This sounds just the same to me as the Lord going through Jerusalem with a candle and searching out the people. Who? The people who have faith. In verse 13, it continues on with the destructions that are happening in Jerusalem. It talks about Jerusalem being plundered. Well, they're being plundered for a reason, and you can see that reason by going to the footnote from verse 13, which goes to Amos 5:11. Quote, "For as much therefore as your treading is upon the poor, and ye take from him burdens of wheat, ye have built houses of hewn stone, but ye have not dwelt in them. Ye have planted pleasant vineyards, but ye shall not drink the wine of them." End quote. This mirrors the words that happen in Zephaniah verse 13, where the Lord is saying you'll have all these riches, but you won't enjoy them. Why will that be? Because there's this anarchy going on, and it's justice because the rich who are being plundered have oppressed the poor. Those who have not oppressed the poor are going to be those who are unified, those who are sharing all that they have with the poor. Those will be the people that will build up Zion. In verse 15, it talks about that the day this is happening is a day of wrath and gloominess. End times parallel is that the wheat harvest is a day of trouble, destruction, and gloominess. In verse 16, it talks about a couple of things that give us clues to the timeline again. It talks about a day of trumpets and a siege against cities. Quote, a day of the trumpet and alarm against fenced cities and against the high towers, end quote. Of course, during this time of famine, this time of disruption of supply lines, if you're living in a city, it's going to be a time of alarm there, a time where those cities are going to be in deep trouble. But also here, trumpets remind me of the 7 trumpets talked about in the book of Revelations, which also happened during the wheat harvest. And if you click here on the footnote for fenced cities, you'll go here to Doctrine and Covenants 101:57, which says, quote, therefore get ye straightway unto my land, break down the walls of mine enemies, throw down their tower and scatter their watchmen, end quote. I think this can relate both to the redemption of Zion, which is the standard interpretation that most people give to verse 57 here. But I think it also could apply to the Jews in Jerusalem. I believe that the great earthquake that's described at the end of the 6th seal is going to destroy many of the lands and walls of the enemies of God. It's going to destroy, I believe, even the Dome of the Rock, and that's what's going to allow the Jews to rebuild the 3rd temple. These are all possible interpretations that I'm giving, but I hope it opens up your mind to what some of these words may allude to here in Zephaniah. Now let's go to verse 17. We're almost done here. Here God brings distress upon men, and he talks about making them walk blind. I think the end times parallel is this great earthquake we just talked about at the end of the 6th seal, which causes this anarchy, and the destructions from the trumpets will bring distress to all men because they will be blind to God's hand and purpose in all these signs. It will thus terrify them and make them depressed. For those who have faith, however, they will not be blind, and they will see these as signs that Christ is coming soon, and the Lord will guide them to Zion. We're going to end here in verse 18. Verse 18 says that the money will not deliver the people in the day of God's wrath. The end times parallel is that currency and even precious metals will not be able to save people during these conditions, which are also described in Joel chapter 1. Brothers and sisters, when I read the book of Zephaniah, I read it knowing that God is doing all of these things, even the things that seem terrible, for the purpose of waking people up so that they can be harvested to places of safety and have their appointed meeting with Jesus Christ at his second coming appearance to them, or to cause them to be destroyed, thereby inflicting justice on those who had evaded justice for so long. When we read the news today, it seems like all of the stories are about all of these injustices that are happening, both to poor people who are powerless in wars and in crimes and injustices of oppressive governments, as well as the injustices of those who are rich and powerful. And one day, Christ will return, and he will bring justice. And that's what Zephaniah reminds me of. I give you my testimony that Jesus Christ is the God of justice and the God whose arm is stretched out still to each of us. And I hope you will join me this next week as we go through Zephaniah chapter 2 and talk about the end times events that are prophesied there. I give you my testimony that Jesus is the Christ, and now is the time to prepare because he is coming soon. I say this in Jesus' name. Amen.